The Ford Mustang. The first, wait, no, not the first. That was the Barracuda. The only, no, the Camaro still exists. The quintessential American pony car. For almost 60 years, this car has been known and mostly loved by everybody and it seems their brother. That being said, why am I making a video about a car that's been discussed quite a lot? Because I'm not very creative, and I didn't have anything to talk about. So this is what we're doing. I hope you like learning about old pony cars. As some of you may know, the Mustang has a very deep and rich history. I don't really want to talk about the generation part of that history, so I'm going to have my buddy Dan the Computer Man tell you that. Off to you, Dan.
Here's a brief history of the Ford Mustang. The first generation from 1964 to 1973. The first generation Mustang was unveiled on April 17, 1964, at the New York World's Fair. It was available as a coupe or convertible with various engine options and trim levels. The Mustang became an instant success, selling over 1 million units within the first 2 years. Second generation from 1974 to 1978. The second generation Mustang, also known as the Mustang II, was introduced in 1974. It was smaller and more fuel-efficient than its predecessor due to changing market demands and the oil crisis. However, the Mustang II received mixed reviews from enthusiasts. Third generation from 1979 to 1993. The third generation Mustang, commonly referred to as the Fox Body Mustang, was introduced in 1979. It featured a more streamlined design and improved performance. During this era, Ford introduced special editions like the Mustang SVO from between 1984 and 1986, and the high-performance Mustang GT from 1982 and onwards. Fourth generation from 1994 to 2004. The fourth generation Mustang debuted in 1994 and showcased a radical redesign. It featured a more rounded, aerodynamic body and introduced the retro-inspired styling cues that would become a hallmark of future Mustangs. Notable models during this era included the Mustang SVT Cobra with a powerful V8 and limited edition independent rear suspension, and the Mustang Bullitt with a limited edition color and blackout package. Fifth generation from 2005 to 2014. The fifth generation Mustang marked a return to the classic styling of the early models. Introduced in 2005, it drew inspiration from the original Mustangs of the 1960s. The fifth-generation Mustang offered various engine options, including a powerful V8 in the Mustang GT and a supercharged V8 in the Shelby GT 500. Sixth generation from 2015 to 2023. The sixth-generation Mustang was unveiled in 2014, celebrating the car's 50th anniversary. It featured a more refined design with modern technologies and improved performance. This generation introduced a turbocharged 4-cylinder EcoBoost engine alongside the V6 and V8 options. The sixth-gen Mustang was also the first generation with independent rear suspension as standard. Seventh generation from 2024 and onward. The seventh-generation Mustang, introduced in 2022 as a 2024 model, it featured a more refined design with modern technologies and improved performance. It also marks a significant shift as Ford transitions the Mustang lineup to electric power. However, Ford continues to produce the traditional Mustang with internal combustion engines as well.
Thanks, Dan. That was awesome. Now, if you want to move to the subject of engines in the Ford Mustang, throughout its history, it's stayed pretty consistency with having 2 or 3 different configurations of engine. Now, I'm not going to go over every different trim of each engine because there are dozens. But they usually either had a 6-cylinder, which either came in a straight 6 or a V6, and the Mustang has always had a V8, whether that be supercharged or naturally aspirated. However, there were a few years where the Mustang was equipped with an inline-4 engine. whether that be a naturally aspirated inline-4 engine like the 1980s and 1990s, and a little bit in the 70s, or that be the turbocharged EcoBoost engine of the S550 generation, and subsequently S650 generation. The biggest engine to ever be put in a Mustang, and please let me know if I'm wrong, although I'm sure you would anyway, was a 429 cubic inch overhead valve engine in both the 1969 and 1970 Ford Mustang, Boss 429. You can probably guess where they got the 429 part of Boss. About 3 years into the Mustang's life in 1967, Chevrolet introduced its Camaro, which was meant to be a direct competitor to the Ford Mustang. For the better part of both of their lives, except for a few years in the mid-2000s, it did just that. The Mustang and Camaro would compete in sales, in power, and just general popularity for that year. And it usually ended up with the Camaro having a little bit more power, but the Mustang selling a little bit more. Later in the Mustang's life, in the mid to late 80s, Ford was trying to find a way to compete with Asian companies like Toyota and Nissan, or at that time, Datsun. They were trying to beat each other instead of with horsepower, they were trying to beat with miles per gallon, reliability, and, again, sales. So this drove Ford to develop a new Mustang, which would be front-wheel drive. The biggest engine it would have was a V6, and it would come with a 5-speed manual transmission. However, the original designer of the Mustang, Lee Iacocca, when he found this out, basically told Ford no. So the Mustang that came out that year resulted as the Fox Body Mustang. This example of a Mustang is a 2005 S197 Mustang, unfortunately equipped with the 4-liter Cologne V6. However, it is equipped with the 5-speed manual transmission, and it has the pony package, which is just a nicer interior. So without further ado, let's get to the test drive of this wonderful car. Wait. No, wait, no. He looks lost. That's not me. Hold on, let me fix it. Okay. Take 2. Let's get to the test drive. However, it does occur to me that it's kind of hard to talk about the car when I'm driving all around in a very quick manner. And it's also kind of bad on gas, so I'm gonna just stop here so I can show you around the car. Wait a minute, this is a Mustang, who am I kidding? Let's talk about speed and power. In terms of power, this car has about 210 horsepower from the factory, which isn't great, and it makes about 250 foot-pounds of torque, which is slightly more great. However, it still pales in comparison to the current highest horsepower held by a factory Mustang, which is, as you probably know, the 2020 GT500, with its 760 horsepower. However, this specific car makes a little bit more than the 210 because it has an aftermarket intake system, an aftermarket sparks system, ignition system, sorry. And it has, well, just better exhaust. While that horsepower isn't the most amazing thing ever, the car only weighs about 3,100 pounds, which, granted, that is heavy for most sports cars, but that 200 horsepower works quite well with the weight of the car. And I bet you're wondering, going off of the weight of the car, how does it handle? Well, all the stuff you see about driving around a corner and sliding into a crash, that's not entirely off. However, it is, because I have the lighter engine in this car, the handling's actually a little bit better. So I can go around corners pretty easy. And you may be wondering, since it's not a V8 and I have the V6 in this car, what type of mileage does it get? Well, it's not as great as it should be because it does have all the aftermarket intake and everything. So for highway it gets about 23 miles per gallon, and for city it gets about 20. Back to the kind of speed and power part of this portion. The 0 to 60 of this car is about 7 seconds. It's technically 7.1, but who's counting tens of seconds? A lot of people. But and it has a top speed of an astounding 120 miles an hour. Yeah, I know. The Ford limited it because they have an externally balanced drive shaft. It's not awesome. And since this is an American car, you may be wondering, oh, what's the quarter mile time? Because that's all American cars are good at. And it's not great. The fastest anyone's ever got in a V6 S197 is about 15 seconds. So yeah, it's not stellar, but it's not the worst ever. Back to this car, it does have aftermarket rear control arms, and it does have about twice as wide tires that came on the car originally. So it has more grip than the normal car. It's just, it's a V6, so you can't really utilize all of it. This car, being from the mid-2000s and being an American car, does have the standard of that time plastic interior. However, as I said earlier, this does have the pony package, which is blacked leather where gray cloth would usually be. So the seats, the side door panels, just stuff like that. For those of you wondering, because I feel like there are some people wondering, these cars, right now with the way the economy is, are worth about $7,000. I personally don't know how much this car cost, but I do know that, in my personal opinion, $7,000 seems like a bit much for a V6 kind of economy Mustang from the mid-2000s. It's just, that seems expensive. And adding on to that, a GT costs about $10,000 if you get a bad one with an automatic. With the manuals, it's like, it's crazy. They can get up to like 20 just in where I am. Something special about the design of the S197s is it was one of the first kind of big name cars. It certainly wasn't the first, but it was one of the first big, like, brand name cars to use a design language called retrofuturism, which is to take a design from, say, the 60s, or in the case of the very first one, the 30s, and just make it modernized. So make it so the bumpers all line up with modern standards, make it so the headlights are big enough, just stuff like that. Certain examples of this are, well, the Mustang, and the PT Cruiser is one, even though that one didn't turn out very well. The Plymouth Prowler was one, and basically any American muscle car today. So, like I said, the Mustang, the Challenger, the Camaro, not so much the Charger because they just kind of changed the whole look of that. But yeah, that's how they design these things. An interesting thing with the 2005 model specifically was, since the car was designed in Detroit, the gas station pump handles didn't have fume hoods or fume covers or whatever. So what ended up happening is, when it got sent to a place with fume hoods, for example, like California, what would happen is, since there wasn't a way to vent the fumes from the gas out of the fuel filler pipe that went around the fume hood, it would just clog up the whole thing. So what ended up happening is, well, Ford recalled it, but since it just was such a weird thing, it wasn't like a full recall. They only recalled like 50% of the cars that were actually made with that issue, and for the rest, they released a whole list of things you could do to get around it. But the first thing on this list was to turn the fuel filler handle upside down when you put it into the filler pipe. So if you ever see someone with an S197 at the gas station with the filler handle upside down, you know why. It's because otherwise they'd be sitting there for 30 minutes going gooch, gooch. As you well know, probably, I think Dan the Computer Man said it, the S550, which is the generation after this one, came with independent rear suspension as standard. So what that means is, this generation, the S197, is built like a truck. It's both tires are on the end of basically a big metal pole that contains the differential and axles. But what that means is, since it's a Mustang and people like to show off Mustangs, so they'll try and peel out of a parking lot. This goes back to when it slides into a crowd. Is, since it's dependent rear suspension, meaning if one side goes up, the other side is affected. Well, that means since the car is leaning and you're losing traction, one side is picked up. So the side that has traction is picked up, and you lose all traction, which means you lose control and you slide, unfortunately for this car, usually into a crowd of bystanders wanting to look at, say, a car show or a car parade. Another part of owning a Mustang that a lot of people don't talk about is, well, the practicality. It's really for insurance purposes. So you have your two front seats and the two back seats. In the old days, it was called a 2+2. But the back seats aren't really meant for human-sized people. They're more like munchkin-sized people. So I personally like to call it, instead of a back seat, I like to call it a people pouch, just because you can fit one, maybe two really tight people. They're gonna be squished. It's it's not great. In the higher models, like the GT500 and all the Sailings and even the Bullet of later generations and previous generations, they did what, in my opinion, all the Mustangs should have. They did a rear seat delete. So instead of a seat being back there, so you try to get people back there, it's just basically a compartment. Another part of the practicality that people don't usually talk about, or they just kind of lie about for some reason, is the trunk size. While it is a big trunk, it can't hold much. It can't hold two of its own tires. So what ends up happening is, because in all the things you can, they all say, oh, it can fit two golf club bags. It really can't. It can maybe fit one if you put it in kind of cockeyed, but that gives, like, say, new Mustang owners a false sense of security, because this is just a personal example. You'll go to buy like a set of tires for another car, and you can't fit them in the trunk. So what ends up happening is you have to then put one in the trunk just because that's all that can fit, and put the rest in the people pouch back there. So you're driving around and all the tires are flying around, and it's a very weird situation. Well, we're stopped. Might as well talk about how comfortable the car is. The seats are they're interesting, because they're kind of like racing bucket styles from back in the 60s, but they're just modernized. I guess they're high backs instead of the low backs that those buckets usually were. But they're not very cushy. It's about the same as, I guess, a diner booth. That's the cushiness level, which in some cases can be very cushy, I guess, but most of the time, if you've been in one, there's a little give, but not so much. You wouldn't want to sit in it for more than, say, 2 hours at a time. An interesting comparison that I don't really see a lot of people make, and I only say this because I have access to both of these cars, is a V6 Mustang from about 2005 compared to a Chrysler Crossfire from about 2005. Just the base one, not the SRT. Because spec-wise anyway, not so much looks or anything, or weight. Well, weight is a spec, but they're so incredibly similar that it's surprising that they're not compared more, because while the Mustang factory makes 210 horsepower, the Crossfire makes 215. Although the Crossfire makes closer to 200 foot-pounds of torque, while the Mustang makes about 250. It's a very weird combination. They both have V6s, although the Mustang's is bigger at 4 liters compared to the 3.2 liters of the Crossfire. Although the Crossfire does weigh about 200 pounds less at 2,900. So it's a very, very strange kind of combination of things. Well, and while the Mustang 0 to 60 is 7.1, 7.2, the Crossfire is a 7 to 7.1. It's very strange. And again, the fastest quarter mile time that the Crossfire's ever got is, say, about, I think it was 14.7 instead of 15. The cars are just so similar, and they kind of line up on so many different specs. It's weird. You don't see them like compared very often, despite them being so similar. In terms of the Ford Mustang, I like it. Mostly because it has a lot of really, really interesting history, but there's a few other reasons. But most of those reasons just kind of sum up to, it's a good looking car, and they're pretty cheap, and for what you pay for it, they're pretty fast. Not as fast as other cars, but faster than most cars. They're just all around pretty good deals. Now, if you've made it to this part of the video, I'm surprised. The driving part kind of dragged on for a while, but thanks for watching all this way, and hope you liked it. Bye.